Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the recording for the State of Oklahoma Boundary Facilitation Workshop. My name is Annie Cahill. I am a technical consultant with Datamark, and we have a training contract with the state to teach you all about boundaries, addressing, introduction to ArcGIS, as well as the toolkit class. So hopefully you will find this content valuable as you all are building better data to support your initiatives and efforts for next generation 911. Okay, so our agenda for today, we're going to talk a little bit about an introduction to boundaries. We're going to also talk about how you can assess boundaries, and then we're going to have an open discussion on or review actually questions that were submitted by locals. Whenever people registered for the in-person class, we did ask to submit any questions that people were kind of struggling with pertaining to boundaries. So those are going to be at the end of this presentation. All right, so introduction to boundaries. So a boundary is basically a delineation or a division between different entities. Okay, so this can be politically in terms of like a county or a country or a city or a town. It can be something more granular like parcel data. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with parcels, subdivisions, and consolidations. Those boundaries can change easily, whereas with counties, cities, and towns, they don't really change that often. You can also have things that are zones like ecosystems, although for me, those tend to be a little bit fuzzier. They can also be more geographic boundaries. So like if you have a mountain range or something like that, or a river, we have a lot of clients that have riparian boundaries that delineate their individual watersheds or their PSAP boundaries or even their county boundaries. So, and generally those are represented in GIS in some form. You may see those as a dashed line, as a solid line, different colors. There's lots of different ways of going about representing those features on a map. So some examples we just discussed would be political boundaries such as counties, cities, or towns, parcel boundaries, and then because we are talking and focusing really about public safety today, many of you might be familiar with emergency service numbers or emergency service zones, and then of course public safety answering point, which we also call the PSAP boundary. So public safety boundaries in 911 are really we really know these more as like an ESN. So the ESN is associated with every single line in an MSAG. Okay, and an MSAG is a master street address guide, which contains all of the road center lines and their respective ranges. And then there's an ESN number that's associated with each one. Okay, and basically those numbers correspond to each line in the MSAG, and it represents the overlap of the agencies for fire law and medical within that governing authority's jurisdiction. So really the zone, the emergency service zone is like the geographic representation of the ESN. And some people have them mapped. Actually, most people will have those mapped because those are what we would call legacy data sets. Those are data sets that are currently used in 911 more for reference. They are used for call routing, but only as tabular data, so not as spatial data. When we say tabular data, we're saying that that data occurs within a table, within a database that's managed by the telephone company. So the ESNs are actually the responsibility of the telephone company to assign, and the routing is accomplished using that database information that is stored at the telephone company. Okay, so the calls are routed to the PSAPs using that emergency service number. As far as NG 911 public safety boundaries, we have a few things that are going on. So the first is the PSAP boundary, which we've already defined as a public safety answering point. This is the physical boundary of kind of responsibility for call routing. So when I dial 911, who gets my call first? That's what the PSAP boundary defines. It's who gets the call first. The PSAP boundary is managed at the state level, and we'll talk more about the GIS part of it here in just a little bit. The discrepancy agency boundary, which that's how it's referred to in the state of Oklahoma model. In the national model, it's referred to as the provisioning boundary. So those two terms are used interchangeably. The discrepancy agency boundary is essentially like the geofenced area for responsibility of the GIS data. It's basically saying, hey, any data that's within this boundary, I'm responsible for maintaining for my county or my PSAP. Okay, and that is not a call routing boundary. It's a definition boundary that says who's responsible for the data that's within that boundary. And then emergency service boundaries are actually used for selective transfer. So it's going to be used to identify who are the responding agencies based on the service you are in within that geographic area. So the minimum that you have to have for the emergency service boundaries are police or law, fire, and EMS. Those are the minimums, but you can have other emergency service boundaries, such as animal control, poison control, Forest Service. We have clients that are in Florida and Maryland, and they may also develop a Coast Guard boundary for coastal response. But at a minimum, you have to have the fire, law, and EMS boundaries. So in current day 911, or what we would call legacy 911, basically the boundaries that are ESNs or ESEs, those are the ones that you'll see most commonly in GIS. So most people do not currently have the PSAP provisioning or discrepancy agency boundary or ESBs as they're intended with the attributes that are called for in the data model, because those layers specifically are for next generation 911 call routing. But most people or most counties will already start with ESN or ESC data. Now, the thing to remember about this data is that the GIS data itself is only for reference. It is used, maybe there's a map on the wall, maybe you guys have put this into your CAD systems, but this data doesn't have any particular function other than reference. It's just a representation or a reference of what is actually in the tabular data that is being used to route the call. So in current 911, remember that the ESN data, which is within the MSAG and ALI data, that's what actually routes the 911 call, not the GIS data. Okay, so that's really the biggest thing to note about this is many of you guys will have this to start with, but these are not how you're currently routing 911 calls today. These are really just being used for reference. So in next generation 911, the big paradigm shift is that we are really moving away from the MSAG and ALI data. Now, this is not something that's going to happen overnight. Okay, many of us nationally are in this kind of transition stage where you're really going to be using both, and you're still working on, your MSAG, and what you really should be doing at this point is reconciling your GIS data with what's in your MSAG and your ALI data. You want them to answer the same questions, okay? But going forward, we're really focusing on the business needs of today while building data that's going to be used to save lives tomorrow. And so in next generation 911, the PSAP boundary routes the call, not the MSAG and ALI data. And this is what's also called geospatial call routing. And this data is actually owned by the locals. It's not owned by the telephone companies. So the locals are really empowered to build data that is truly reflective to how the call should be routed today, but it's using the geospatial data and not tabular data. So the boundaries for NG911, we've already gone through them. The discrepancy agency boundary, which is that geofence I was discussing, the PSAP boundary, and the ESBs. So essentially, if I'm calling from a civic location is a physical structure with a landline. That civic location is, it's going to look for the address first. If it can't identify the address point, it's going to go to the road center line. Okay, and in a mobile call, of course, we know that almost over 80% of our mobile calls or our 911 calls are coming from mobile devices, what you're going to have to do is make sure that you can capture that location in another way. And so what's going to happen is the geospatial location is going to come in from that 911 call on a mobile device, and it's going to basically drop a pin wherever that call is identified within the PSAP boundary, and it's going to route to the appropriate PSAP. So that's very different than how call routing is accomplished today through the MSAG and ALI tables, and that's why it's so important that we have the GIS data at a level of accuracy and completeness that it should have. All right, so the state of Oklahoma has a very special role in managing the NG 911 boundary data. So the Oklahoma 911 Management Authority actually manages two boundaries for you. The first is the PSAP boundary, and the second is the discrepancy agency boundary. Those are managed at the state level. If you go to the Oklahoma Maps site, you're going to see that the data that's available for download is the PSAP boundary, okay? And these are not in a final draft. These are available for download, and the expectation is that you will review these and sign off on them with the appropriate review and the appropriate process that we're going to discuss here in just a second, okay? The state only maintains the PSAP boundaries right now. That's all they have available for download, but they are working on getting a discrepancy agency boundary built, and that will also be available for download on OK Maps at some point. So you're just going to kind of have to stay engaged with the state, see what they're doing, check out their updates, and see when they upload that data to the website. Okay, so the one that's available for download now is the PSAP boundary, and the expectation is that every PSAP is going to download and review these. So essentially, your role as a local in managing this boundary data is, number one, always remember that as GIS professionals, the GIS professionals are probably different than the PSAP decision makers or the PSAP authorities, but you're all geospatial first responders. Anyone who is editing, modifying, managing, making decisions about this data is a geospatial first responder, okay? Your data is being actively used before a 911 call ever comes in and is answered. So that's what you have to remember. It's not going to be based on these tables anymore. We're trying to minimize call transfers. We're trying to minimize the time that's being spent. So you are geospatial first responders, and your first order of business is to understand that and understand what that means for your GIS data. Your GIS data is having to make decisions about where 911 calls go. It has to be held at a level of accuracy and completeness that it's never had to have before. So it's incredibly important that you make the appropriate decisions. GIS people, you are not PSAP authorities, okay? You are GIS people. You will make the data look pretty. You will topologically align the data. You can move the lines, you can adjust things, but you will only do that under the purview of the PSAP authority, okay? Remember that the PSAP boundary routes the calls, and as GIS people, you really don't want that responsibility that, oh, well, this boundary looks kind of weird, I need to adjust this line so that it doesn't look weird. No, these are thoughtful decisions that must occur in conjunction with the PSAP authority. Okay, so get your 911 coordinators, your first responders, whoever it is, get them in a room and examine the data. And we're going to talk a little bit about that process here in just a few minutes, but you're going to need all stakeholders working together. Okay, it's going to include your public safety folks, your GIS folks. This can be especially challenging if your GIS doesn't really have any type of association with public safety. For example, if your only GIS support lives in the tax assessor's office or in the planning office or in public works, it could be a little bit more challenging, okay? And so this is where you really need to get together and start breaking down the silos and opening up that line of communication, because the GIS people need to understand that there's a greater level of responsibility that's going to be placed on them in managing this data. Okay, this is dynamic living data. It should be continually reviewed, assessed, cleansed, validated, and remediated for the most accurate and reliable data to put into public safety systems. Finally, you may want to also include the addressing authority. A lot of times they have knowledge about particular areas, maybe subdivisions that have strange entrances and, just how things are addressed. Maybe there's a mix of like city, county addressing. So it may be beneficial, not required, but it could be beneficial to bring them into those discussions as well. But the focus needs to be data quality. The PSAP folks have the boots on the ground experience. They have the understanding and the knowledge of who responds, who answers the call first, who's transferring the call. Is there a particular area in the county where calls are bounced back and forth, where calls are transferred more frequently? These are all things that you need to know. There may be MOUs or agreements with other agencies to help with call routing or response. You need to know all of these things. The GIS people are not going to be in possession of this information. Okay, so my process, recommended process, when you're talking about correcting boundaries for public safety. So there's something that is an assumption here in this graphic that the road center lines are solid. I would say this is a great way to go about correcting or assessing your data, the order of operations. If you have decent road center lines, if you don't, you may want to get those in order first. But I would essentially start with the discrepancy boundary. The discrepancy agency boundary is, like I said, that's the geofence that is defining the area of responsibility for that GIS data. Okay. Secondary would be the PSAP boundary. The PSAP boundary is the public safety boundary. That is the answering point. Okay, that's the primary call routing boundary. Now, if you have secondary PSAPs, that's not what we're talking about here. It's the primary. Okay, then what you'll want to do is you'll want to make sure that your ESN data or your ESZs are cleaned up. So in the state model, ESZs are required. They are a required layer. In the national model, they are not. So if you go and reference the national model for whatever reason and you're not seeing any real guidance in there about building ESZ data, it's because they're not required for call routing in next generation 911. But in the state model, they are. And there is a little bit in the state model about this data, but really you just need to make sure that you're sitting with your PSAP people and making sure that this data is solid. You don't have gaps and overlaps. You want to make sure that the ESNs are reflecting the correct information. Okay, because once you make sure that that is solid, then you can build your ESBs from your ESCs or ESNs. And there is a tool within the toolkit that will help you do that. So that's why I recommend that you build that boundary first and make sure that those areas are reflecting the appropriate information, because you can then use that to build your ESBs. And then finally, I would recommend, again, this is assuming that your road center lines are in good shape. I would recommend that you build your road center lines or basically correct them to the appropriate boundaries. Road center lines do need to be snapped and split at obviously road center line intersections, but they need to be split at municipal boundaries, PSAP boundaries, ESNs, wherever you have an attribute change, your road center lines should be split and snapped. Okay, next we're going to talk about assessing boundaries. Okay, so the state has a documented process for amending boundaries, which is actually really good because many states do not. And so I really feel like Oklahoma is very progressive in this way, because you're getting a solid understanding of not only how to correct your public safety boundaries, but also how to deal with annexations. Annexations have been a I guess I would say, a rising topic for me as a consultant dealing with different localities. Everybody handles annexations differently, and sometimes this data is poorly documented. So I think a lot of that has to do with workflows that are not clearly defined. And I think it's great that the state has a document that's out there that helps you navigate that. So I'm going to pull that over. Okay. So firstly, when you go to the Oklahoma 911 Management Authority, you're going to see some documents here. You want to focus on this one here, the one that says Municipal PSAP Maintenance Guidelines. And when you click on that, it's going to bring up this PDF. So there is a documented process for how to handle annexations and de-annexations, where you need to make corrections to existing municipal boundaries. So that's going to be the first thing. Both processes here for annexations and for public safety boundary adjustments are within this document. Okay, so don't think that, if you go here and the first thing you see is annexations, you're like, oh my gosh, where's the public safety stuff? Just keep scrolling down, because here's where you're going to get the 911 PSAP boundary change request. Okay, and here is the process. So what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to obviously look at the data. And this is, again, going to be the public safety folks and the GIS people. All right, so you're going to review those boundaries, preferably with your neighbors. You're going to provide a letter that has the explanation of what needs to change. Your neighbors are going to need to agree and also submit a letter. And then you're going to need to provide a shapefile or feature class of the change that you're requesting. If you want to submit the entire boundary, you can, with the changes. And then, if there's any other supporting documentation, you can also submit that as well. But you have to put it on your official letterhead, and then it has to be signed by the agency head. So whoever's responsible for that 911 information, it's going to have to be signed off by that person. And this is why it's so important to have your 911 involved, because these are 911 boundaries making 911 decisions. Okay, so this is available for you. Again, it's on the Oklahoma 911 Management Authority website. And I have provided that link to you in the PowerPoint right here. All right, so what you're going to do is you're going to review the document and follow that process if you have to make changes. What you can do then is engage your GIS folks to download that data. So you're going to pull up the process, you're going to review it, and then you're going to have the GIS folks download the data from the state. So download that PSAP boundary data. These are screenshots from the toolkit. So these are the validation tools that are available in the toolkit. That's a separate class that we teach. There is a recording out on the web for that. And essentially, you're going to have your GIS folks assess that data. So they're going to run these validations and identify where you've got gaps and overlaps. Now, the thing about the toolkit is that it's only going to assess the individual PSAP boundary. So it's only going to look at your data in your PSAP boundary. Okay, it's not going to look at it compared to your neighbor. So you're going to have to fix whatever is within your own data first, and then go out and meet with your neighbors and run a different process for that. Okay, but essentially the toolkit is going to help you identify any gaps or overlaps. If you have gaps and overlaps in your data, it's going to flag as an error and you will not be able to submit it to the repository. So those have to be resolved first before you try to push that data into the repository. And then you're going to make sure that those are obviously corrected before you can submit. But the thing about the toolkit is you do have to have GIS, you have to have ArcMap specifically to assess the topology and use the toolkit. And there's more information about the toolkit in the toolkit class and online. There's a ton of information out there. I've taught that class a number of times. But please reference the links that the state has available to understand more about the toolkit requirements. So these are just some screenshots that I've taken from the toolkit documentation. When the developers build the toolkit and start thinking about the validations, what they have to do is create what are called rules. And the rules are kind of the framework for identifying what is wrong in the data. Okay, so anything that goes against the rules or violates the rules is something that's going to be flagged as an error. Okay, so you can see that you cannot have gaps with your discrepancy agency boundary. When it says must cover each other, what that means is that the boundary has to fully encompass. So your EMS boundary has to fully encompass the area of your discrepancy agency boundary. It's like if you lay one boundary over another, you should not have any blank space. You should not have any holes in your boundaries. You should not have any big areas. Everything has to align with one another. That's what must cover each other means. One boundary has to cover the other and has to align fully. So that's the case for all three of the ESBs, the ESZ, and the PSAP boundary. It all has to cover the discrepancy agency boundary. Okay. Now, as far as the address point, all of the address points must be properly inside the discrepancy agency boundary. So you have to make sure that all of the address points are geographically within that boundary. And the same with road center line, they must be inside that boundary. All right. And again, this is in the toolkit documentation. If you guys download that and look at that, the README has all of this in there. Now, as far as the toolkit is concerned, you can have exceptions. And what does an exception mean? An exception means that it actually is something that technically, when you look at it, it looks like it violates the rule. But an exception means that it doesn't really violate the rule for whatever reason. Okay, so for example, exceptions are only allowed in the road center lines feature class. So with the road center lines, the rule is it must be inside the discrepancy agency boundary. So essentially, if there's any road center lines that go outside of your boundaries, it's going to flag that as an error and say, no, you can't submit this because it's outside of your discrepancy agency boundary. However, there are some occasions where you may need to make that adjustment. Okay, so for example, if I go back up to the screenshot, say you've got a county boundary, so that green dashed line, for example, is the county boundary. The only way to access the subdivision that is in gray is through County A. Okay, so you kind of have two options. You can either mark that data as an exception, or you can adjust your PSAP boundary, which, usually one will happen after the other, right? So generally, if there hasn't been an official decision made yet because you haven't had an official boundary workshop with your neighbor, you might just say, look, we've got to have the road in there and the address points because we always end up getting those calls. It makes sense for us to go out there. So, we need to have that in our data, even though it's technically not in our PSAP. That would be an exception. You would mark those road center lines as an exception. Okay. However, further down the road, I think the expectation would be that you decide to make that adjustment to encompass that area. But these are future discussions that you'll want to have with your neighbors when the time comes. Okay. So again, exceptions are only allowed in the road center lines, and you want to make sure that you're asking the question, hey, am I working around a problem or am I making the data better? What you don't want to do is overload the data with exceptions, because what happens is when you say this data is an exception, it doesn't get validated, right? So whatever has an exception means that it's not going to be run through the toolkit. It's subject to the same validations that the rest of the data is. And you need to make thoughtful decisions, right? You don't want to overload this data with exceptions, because then are you really making it the highest quality that you can for public safety? You may need to ask a different question. Do I need to maintain a separate road center lines just for my public safety business needs? And for a lot of folks, that does make the most sense. If people are managing with a linear referencing system, I worked for a client once that had Their main GIS, they used a linear referencing system, and their public safety people needed them to manage a data set for NG 911, but of course that involves snapping and splitting across certain boundaries. And the main GIS folks said, no, we're not doing that because that's going to ruin our linear referencing system. And so the decision was made, okay, fine, we're going to manage our own independent NG 911 road centerline data set, and we're just going to get the deltas from the main data authority and update that accordingly. So you may have to make thoughtful decisions depending on who's managing the data, and that's really what you need to ask when you're starting to assess this data. Always remember that when you're assessing these boundaries, you need to ask who gets the call first. This is not fully about response. Yes, response does come in, especially in those areas where you have to go outside of your PSAP boundary. Even though the call should be answered by a different county, does it always end up being transferred to the other PSAP? It's not always appropriate to just take things at face value. You always have to ask who gets the call first to make those decisions. Then you're going to follow the state process that we discussed to amend the PSAP boundary. Okay. Follow that process, write the letters, meet with your neighbors, agree. And don't make exceptions on data that's poor quality just to get it to pass the validations. Because again, this data is being used to route calls for 911. Okay, this is not just a reference data set. This has an active performing function in the course of a 911 call. Okay. The screenshot that I included below just talks about exceptions, and it basically says that the road centerline feature class includes a topo accept field. So when we say field, we mean that there's a column within the data that is called topo accept. So essentially that's the field in which you would mark the exception. So the exceptions are must not have dangles, and that means that a road just dead ends. Everybody is probably going to have those in their data set. Okay. It's either a true dead end or it's something like a cul-de-sac. So it has to be marked as an exception, and also must be inside discrepancy agency boundary. Some of them will be both. Like when we look at that other example, this is an example of a road that dead ends where that gray arrow stops, but it's also outside of the discrepancy agency boundary if we are assuming that the green dashed line is also a discrepancy agency boundary. So it would actually be both. It's going to be an exception to both. We're just kind of pretending that, the county adjustment, the PSAP line is not there. But if it's a dead end, it's considered a dangle, and you have to fix that in the data. The problem is that you don't want to have to do that multiple times. Can you guys imagine how many cul-de-sacs and dead ends you have in your communities? You want to do it once. So this is where if you have another agency that's managing your road center lines and you're getting a cut of that data, you want to make thoughtful decisions about how you're going to mark those exceptions, because you don't want to have to go through this process over and over and over again, right? Can you imagine if you have 300 road center lines that have dead ends, you're going to have to go through and mark that every single time you validate the data? No, you want this to be something that lives within the parent data, the default data that you're getting. Okay, so this is how you're going to use that topo accept field. So maybe you want to build a topo accept field into your main primary data set that's being managed by, the GIS agency or Public Works, whoever's managing your road center line feature class, because we see data management occur differently in different communities. Not everyone does it the same, but you want to make sure that those changes happen where they're actually being managed, so that when you get a cut of that data, it's basically inheriting whatever is in the parent, and you're not having to go through and do it each time. Okay. These are examples of some things that we see in boundary workshops. Okay. Often we see, you have a gap here. This white space is essentially a gap between two PSAPs. The same here, just with aerial imagery. There's a whole community that has not been encompassed by any PSAP boundary. The red is essentially an overlap area. Whenever you run a topology between two data sets, usually neighbors, right? So the green is one neighbor, the brown is the other, in this top graphic here. So whenever you run and compare two different data sets, wherever there's a gap or an overlap, the gap will be just, blank, and then the overlap will actually be red. So this is a very common thing that we see. We see a lot of structures that are not encompassed by any PSAP boundary, which means that call is not going to be routed if it comes in through that gap. Okay, if it doesn't have PSAP coverage, that means it's not going to a PSAP boundary, or not going to a PSAP. It's not associated with a PSAP boundary, so it's not going to get routed. And then down here, if you have a call that occurs within an overlap of PSAPs, it's going to default route. So that just means that, you're going to have a machine making the decisions for you. Okay, so we've already talked about cleaning up the data within your own boundary. Okay, well, you're going to use the toolkit to help you do that. So the next thing I want you guys to think about as part of the state process that we've outlined is getting your neighbors engaged. Okay, so you're going to download the PSAP boundaries. You're going to look at the internal topology using the toolkit. We've already talked about that. Then what you're going to do is your GIS folks should really run the topology with the PSAP and the neighboring PSAPs. Okay, so you're going to take your data and run it through a topology process with your neighbors. Now, remember, the toolkit is only running it internally, okay? Your GIS people are going to have to run it compared to the neighbors. And then what they should do for you is build a map package, or maybe an application if you guys are using ArcGIS Online, whatever the preferred way is to review the data. Your GIS folks need to build you something to review that includes the obviously the PSAP boundaries first and foremost, but also additional data if you guys have aerial photography. If not, consider using the Esri imagery. It's actually pretty decent. I mean, we use this in a lot of our work, and it tends to be pretty good. So the PSAP boundaries, the aerial photography, parcel data can be extremely helpful. Any municipal boundaries. So if you want to include the county boundary, if you want to include any city or town boundaries, and then of course your address points and your road center lines, all of those data sets can be extremely helpful. You could also bring in, your ESZ data if you wanted to. There's lots of other data sets that you can bring in to support these conversations with your neighbor. Anything that's a helpful reference or anything to provide additional context is very important. If you have neighborhood boundaries, if you have a lot of subdivisions, that might be helpful for documentation purposes. There's lots and lots of different data available to you, I'm sure, at the local level that you guys can use. And, just have them add it to the map, and you can keep it turned off and then turn it on as you need it. So after they build this for you, then you're going to want to schedule meetings with each neighbor. Okay, these could be virtual, but hopefully if you guys are close in distance, you can actually bring them into a meeting room and sit down and project the map. And then you're going to sit down and review it. Now, the key stakeholders that must be at this meeting are the PSAP authorities. Those are the most important stakeholders. Okay, they are the ones that are making the decisions about where those boundaries actually go. So they must be invited. And they must be the ones actually making the decisions. They should not send a GIS person or it has to be whoever is the authority for making those decisions. The GIS people can come. It would be extremely beneficial, and they should come so that they can understand what's expected of them. And as a matter of fact, they might want to go ahead and make changes to the data right while they're sitting there. They might want to add edits to the map as the discussions are occurring so that everything is captured in real time. This is really the best way of doing this. Um, and of course, anybody else who can support that discussion, like sometimes there are first responders who might want to come because they might be able to provide additional context concerning response or call routing or transfer scenarios. Dispatchers, I mean, there's tons and tons of different stakeholders that can support this discussion. What to bring? First and foremost, I recommend donuts. Those are always helpful when you're meeting with a group of people. But we also want you to bring anything that's documented. So if you have existing MOUs, if you have legal documentation, if you trust your MSAG and that's something that you think would be a helpful resource to you, I highly recommend that you bring your MSAG. And then, of course, that local knowledge. We know that we have a lot of these people on our staff that are just incredibly knowledgeable, and it's just stuff that they've had in their minds for years and years and years, and maybe they're close to retirement. You want to get that out. You want to get that knowledge out of their head and onto paper, okay? Because that's extremely important. So what you're going to do is get in that room together. You're going to review your existing paperwork, and then you're going to start going down the boundary with you and your neighbor, and you're going to review whatever has come up in the workshop. You're going to review those anomalies, and then you're going to make any critical decisions necessary. So if you see a gap where, maybe a subdivision is not being included and there's a question as to why is there no coverage here? The question that you need to ask is, who gets the call? Who gets the call first? Who should get the call? And if we're determining that 9 times out of 10, that call it's supposed to be transferred, and it's always transferred, then maybe you need to make decisions about adjusting that PSAP boundary. Maybe that's the most appropriate decision. It's about who gets the call, not always about who's responding. It's who's answering that call. All right, and then you're going to follow that paperwork that I showed you earlier with the state's process. You're going to follow that process, and you're going to document your decisions with your neighbor, and everybody's going to give the appropriate sign off, and then that data is going to be sent up to the state. Okay. So some best practices for building sustainable NG 911 boundaries. First and foremost, you need to understand that these boundaries have a purpose and they must be built as such with that in mind, okay? A county boundary is not the same as a PSAP boundary. I know that seems kind of weird to say. They might look the same, but they have two totally different functions. If you actually look at the requirements behind each data set or the information, remember that GIS is geography and information. If you look past the geography into the information, you're going to see that the PSAP boundary has a very, very specific set of requirements that are included within that data set. Okay, whereas a county boundary, you might just have something that says Washington. A PSAP boundary is going to have a lot more information included in it because it is built with a purpose. Okay, so with that being said, we always have to be mindful about that and the fact that we don't just take the county boundary at face value, right? We have to make sure that the boundaries that we're building for call routing are really reflective of what that boundary is trying to accomplish. Okay, so you always want to review and assess your data annually. Download the data annually, review it annually, especially if you're dealing with a lot of annexations, if you have interior PSAP boundaries where, the county boundary changes frequently, and so the municipal boundaries also change, which causes a change in the PSAP boundaries. You all need to stay on top of that and make those adjustments and download those and assess them annually. Okay. Annexations can impact your boundaries. Now, if it's one PSAP for everybody, then that's fine. However, your GIS data also needs to reflect the community values. So although your PSAP boundary might not be directly impacted, when you do an annexation, your road center lines and your address points are always going to be impacted because the community information is changing. And because the geographic boundary is changing, that's new splitting and snapping for you. So don't think that just because, oh, my municipal boundary has changed, but that doesn't impact my PSAP boundary. You still need to be mindful about how annexations impact the rest of your GIS data. It's not just about the PSAPs, okay? I do also recommend that you establish and document any workflows for managing your boundaries and your GIS data as your boundaries change. So some considerations for boundary adjustment, obviously annexations, we've talked about at length, future subdivisions or development. A lot of you in your planning departments, you'll have access to, future or planned development information, whether that's in a, binder somewhere on a shelf, or maybe there's a GIS file that kind of reviews how your communities are expected to change. Maybe you'll have a new fire station and you'll consequently have a new ESN developed. There's lots of different considerations in the future that you guys might want to take into consideration. Your core services provider might have requirements of the boundaries as well. So whenever the state has those discussions and determines who the core service provider is going to be, you guys might want to stay engaged there and understand how that is going to impact your PSAP boundaries, because those are changes that are going to have to be made. And you want to stay engaged, even though the state is technically managing those data sets and they have them available for download. You all are the ones responsible for assessing, reviewing, and amending those, and then submitting those changes. Snap 2 points are really important and can actually help you have a better road centerline network. And Snap 2 point is basically a point that is developed at the end of each road center line. And as you have a road center line that extends through different PSAPs or different counties, you can use those points to help you easily snap to your neighbors. So that way you have a fluid and connected road center line network. All right. So the ideal NG911 data management workflow. First of all, you're going to have to define those stakeholder relationships. If you're a public safety professional and you don't know who's managing your GIS data, or maybe it's someone that's not connected to your department in any way, this is a great time to get them together and say, hey, look, have you heard about NG911? Do you know what that means for us as a county? And then start those conversations. We have lots of trainings that could benefit GIS folks, public safety folks, and addressing authorities. And I highly recommend that everyone starts getting engaged. Establish those authoritative data sets. Just because the road centerline maintenance has always lived with public works, does that mean that's where it should stay? Are you getting the most up-to-date authoritative data sets from the people who are managing it currently? Are they managing the data for different business needs? Data creation. Do new data sets need to be made? Do you have an ESN data set? Would you even know how to start that creation? Right? So you have to ask these questions, because the ESNs are going to be required with the rest of the NG911 data. Once you get that data created, you need to start building it out into the appropriate schema, and then you need to validate that data. Okay, who's going to do that? Who is the most capable? Do you have the software that's required? Do you have the GIS software? You're going to want to make sure that data is remediated with the appropriate stakeholder group. Just because your NG911 people or your public safety people run the validations, it doesn't mean that they're going to be the agency that's responsible for cleaning up the data, right? So you have to make those decisions as well. How am I going to get that data, the results of those validations, back to the appropriate stakeholder? And how am I going to stay engaged and connected to make sure that those corrections are done and submitted back in a routine process, something that's iterative, right, and repeatable? And then, of course, you're going to want to make sure that that data is shared out and published. You don't want disconnected data sets. All right, all your public safety stuff your CAD, your 911 system, your core services, hopefully are all working on the same version of your GIS data. And then of course you want to have feedback, right? If your first responders are using this data, your dispatchers, you want to make sure that these people have a way to communicate any errors to you, because that's going to be incredibly important going forward. So preferably we want to stop the post-it note process that's going on, where things just kind of get jotted down and passed on, and then there's no real resolution behind it. Preferably using something like a ticketing system, or having something that's date and time stamped. You could even use an email, but not only saying, hey, this citizen has the wrong address posted. It's the responsible agency coming back and saying, yes, we've received this. We're doing a site visit, next Wednesday, and we will return the results of that visit to you as soon as possible. And then when there's a resolution, you want to make sure that that is provided back to the person reporting the anomaly. Okay, it's very important that you have this feedback. We don't want to make the lives of our dispatchers, call takers, and first responders more difficult. We want to alleviate the stress, not add to it. And we also want to make sure that if they're going through the effort of reporting what they're seeing in the data, that we're also doing our due diligence as GIS people and as data authorities, and making sure that we provide them that very valuable feedback. Okay, it's now time to go through the local questions that were submitted. Um, we did receive a couple of different things. So I think that some of these things will resonate with some of you. We did have some questions concerning ramps on highways. Are they ever part of a city's jurisdiction? Yes, sure. It's about where they're geographically located. And if we're talking about them in reference to a PSAT boundary, it's always going to be about who gets the call. So if you're on a ramp on an interstate, and you're concerned about how to adjust or modify that PSAT boundary, it's who's going to answer the call on that ramp. Okay. So there was another question about authoritative and accurate county data set, and I was unclear about what is meant by a county data set. Does it mean just the county boundaries, or countywide data such as address points? I'm just assuming county boundaries, because I know that a lot of people expect their states to have on file an official, accurate, and correct county boundary data set. And that is generally not the case. I've been in states where the state has a comprehensive data set available for the county boundaries, but they do not actually align with what the locals have on file. So I would say your local data is probably going to be the best bet as far as something authoritative. So then we had another one concerning calls and call transfers within, between a town and a county. And essentially, we felt like, based on the description, that it was an AT&T wireless routing issue. So there is a form that you can get from AT&T that's called a wireless call routing spreadsheet, and you can actually modify that and submit it to them if you need something changed. We did have question concerning topology, and someone struggling working through the topology process, because that's huge. That is a huge part of cleaning up your data and getting it to pass the validation so that it can be uploaded into the repository. And we do show some advanced data editing in the toolkit class. And then we also talk about topology in the Introduction to ArcGIS course. We did have a question concerning a state boundary and MSAG alley. So the area in purple is the area of a county that's serviced by a particular fire company in Kansas, but it was never entered into the county's MSAG due to it being serviced by an out-of-state entity. So the question is, how do I go about addressing this, that everything in the county is accurately entered into the MSAG? And since we're crossing state boundaries, we could have two different MSAG and alley providers. I don't really know what's going on in Kansas for their providers. But it is possible to have two different ones. So we always recommend that you communicate with the other town and then inform them that they need to remove that data from their MSAG, and then the county should actually add that data to their MSAG. And then the Kansas County would also need to remove the data from their GIS, the PSAP and ESB for fire, and possibly police and EMS would need to be adjusted as well. You could also have an MOU in place. There's a few different ways of handling this based on the question that was asked. We don't have a lot of detail, but this is just kind of like our initial assessment based on the information we received. So those are the local questions that we received. I highly recommend that if you want to attend any of the classes in person, that when you register, you submit your local questions. That way we can have a more fruitful and comprehensive discussion. Thank you all. If you have any questions, I would encourage you to reach out to Shelley Willoughby, and we appreciate your time today.